Welcome to TYT's The Conversation. It is your host, Adrienne Lawrence. And now I am joined by civil rights attorney and the author of Sexual Justice, Supporting Victims, Ensuring Due Process, and Resisting the Conservative Backlash. That's Alexandra Brodsky. Thank you so much for joining us, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, so there's a lot going on right now. And I know your book, Sexual Justice, is so incredibly needed, especially since we just had the 50th anniversary of Title IX. Also, we're seeing these issues come up when it comes largely to privacy rights that impact gender with this Roe v. Wade leak from the Supreme Court with that draft opinion. I don't even know where necessarily to begin, but let's go ahead and start with your book, Sexual Justice. So can you give the viewers kind of a snapshot about what you are writing about?
Sure. So sexual justice was my attempt to intervene in this public conversation that we've been having over the last couple of years about what it means to respond fairly to allegations of sexual harassment in a way that's fair to everyone involved. And really the crux of the book is that we've got to be able to hold two things in our heads at the same time. And one is that absolutely, whenever someone's accused of wrongdoing, including sexual wrongdoing, and they deny it, they should have the opportunity to tell their side of the story. Their employer or their school shouldn't jump to conclusions. But what's also true is that anti-feminists, particularly on the right, have co-opted these concerns about due process for the accused, really not to ensure fairness, but to ensure that victims are never heard, to ensure that men, and particularly white men, never get in trouble for sexual harms. And so we've got to be able to recognize both dynamics at once.
No, absolutely. And that's something when I wrote my book that I definitely seem to run into. This whole call for due process was largely this thought of, oh, let's not hold these white men accountable for their misconduct. And we'd see a number of people who were accused of sexual harassment, whether it was valid or not, generally befell men of color or men who are lower on the spectrum, whether it is class, but these things that really show us how the hierarchies in our society operate. And so when you say in terms of people being heard on both sides, are you saying that these generally white men who are accused of sexual harassment are not getting a fair shake in terms of not being heard?
I think that by and large, they are getting more than a fair shake. And I guess that's part of what I find frustrating, that it's certainly true when we look at, let's say, workplaces today, where in a non-unionized workplace, private company, a worker can be fired at any time for basically any reason. And so I have no doubt that there are workers who are fired every day based on accusations of things that they didn't really do. And I'm not just talking about sexual harassment, I'm talking about all kinds of, alleged wrongdoing. And so I think that we should certainly be attuned to building up fair investigations within workplaces, within schools. And that's not anti-survivor, right? That's good for victims too, because they also want the chance to explain what happened, to present evidence. What kills me though is that we see, let's say someone like Governor Cuomo, who talk about a fair process. He had an independent investigation put together by the New York Attorney General that found that he had committed sexual harassment against multiple employees. And still, after all that, he and his supporters were going around saying, well, what about due process? What about due process? And that's just a meaningless term at that point. All he's saying is, it's unfair that I could ever face repercussions for my actions.
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And that's something that I definitely ran across in my research in terms of people, they're largely upset because they had to face some semblance of accountability. And also in part because it's this mentality oftentimes that I like to call them harassholes, think that they are not facing any consequences because their colleagues are engaging in the similar behavior. But that's also this mentality of everybody does it. And generally when it comes to misconduct, a lot of people think, oh, well, everybody does it. Like everybody lies, everybody steals, everybody skims off the top. And that's very much a harassal mentality when it's not necessarily true, where it is generally limited to a smaller number of people who are engaged in behavior, but they have in their mind this thought that this is normalized because they've normalized it in their own mentality. But when it comes also to normalized behavior, I really don't know that Title IX has been fully normalized, even though it's 50 years in, because there still seems to be this significant fight when it comes to particularly colleges and this experience around sexual harassment. And so what have you found and what have you learned in your experience? I'm sure that showed up in your book.
Absolutely. I think it's some of our most contentious fights about fair process for sexual harassment allegations have focused on college campuses today, where there's been a tremendous wave of activism by student survivors over the last decade, 15 years, that really encouraged other survivors to come forward and ask their schools for help when they faced some kind of sexual harm that was making it tough for them to learn. And in response to that and to some increased enforcement of the federal civil rights law, Title IX, under the Obama administration, a lot of schools started putting together procedures to deal with these kinds of issues for the first time. And one thing that I talk about a lot in the book is that a lot of people look at those procedures and they think that they're unfair just because they don't look like a criminal trial. People, in their heads, they think, oh, rape is a crime. That means that the only fair way to investigate it is, a judge and jury and cops. But, rape is a crime, but it also is a civil rights issue. And schools and workplaces have an obligation to address that to ensure that survivors can continue to participate in public life. And necessarily, their investigations are going to look different than the criminal justice systems. Anyone who's been in a workplace has seen, that HR can look into a problem in the office or look into a problem among the employees without, putting a bunch of people in robes and having a formal trial.
That definitely seems to be the case, and particularly something I found that in workplaces that you get far more quote unquote due process and opportunities when it comes to sexual harassment. But if you are literally skimming off the top, if you're embezzling, they will put you out on your butt very quickly. And it seems to be a lack of recognition of the fact that your behavior being a harasshole is effectively skimming off the top. It is causing you to lose revenue. It is causing you to lose workers, whether it comes to optimal performance or even just their ability to truly perform their duties and jobs. And the same thing with Title IX in terms of individuals, primarily women, being able to attend school to learn, because schools are businesses at the end of the day. So they are losing, they're losing money at the end of the day. And that's not something that's fully recognized when it comes to the sexual misconduct that goes on, whether it be in the workplace or whether it be in the educational system.
I think that that's absolutely right. And I think that, you're so right to point to the other kinds of misconduct that employers or schools are dealing with, where, employers know how to investigate when someone's really obviously losing, gonna hurt their bottom line. Schools know how to investigate when someone cheats on a paper, and we don't have this kind of, widespread concern that people are being railroaded when they face repercussions for that kind of misconduct. And suddenly you put sex into the equation, and everyone is convinced the allegation must be untrue. The accused must be treated unfairly. And that really stops us from having, smart, important conversations of what does a fair process look like? What's good for victims? What's fair to the accused? And it's really hard to have that conversation when we're constantly dealing with bad faith actors who just want to make sure that sexual harassment is swept under the rug.
No, absolutely. And something that I at least attribute that to is the thought that if they actually acknowledge the fact that it has nothing to do with sex, that this is a power play because they're maintaining the hierarchies that are in place in our society, that have to actually acknowledge that those hierarchies exist, and they don't want to do that, particularly in places like academia. And when you look at major companies, because we see the dynamics of who is a CEO, also who gets tenured positions. We know academia is primarily white male dominated when it comes to leadership and who calls the shots. Same thing when we're talking about major companies. And so this is where you see a lot of this go down, because what it essentially is doing is telling primarily women and people who do not fit this cis hetero white Christian model, it's telling them that we want you to play small, we want you out, we want to put you in a box and hopefully put that box out near the trash. And so if that's not acknowledged, that it's nothing to do with sex, but it's more to do with power, then they'd have to acknowledge that they are in positions of power by virtue of the systems that are created.
I think that's so right. And it also, I think, helps to explain why organizing around sexual harassment by workers or by students, by medical patients can serve as sort of the canary in the coal mine about broader issues of inequality within an institution. Often workers will come together first to talk about sexual harassment in their workplace, and that can lead down the road to unionization, because as they're figuring out, well, what is the boss doing wrong around sexual harassment, they realize how power is working there, and that they need to come together to resist that.
Yes, and it definitely seems like it becomes even more of an uphill climb now that we have the GOP running this terror operation to essentially attack every marginalized group from every angle. I guess, what are your thoughts on that?
Oof. I mean, yeah, it has been we're talking now after just a brutal week of news from the Supreme Court. And a common theme I see in all of this is the way that the GOP is able to pretend that they're acting to protect women, to protect workers, to protect children, when actually what they're doing is undermining those exact people's rights. So it just has been killing me to see the way that Republicans have been celebrating what seems to be the end of Roe by saying that that'll be good for women, when if they were actually interested in women's health, in supporting families, there are a million and one things that they could do, and instead they're going after women's autonomy and people's autonomy to build the families that they want.
Yeah, and it's interesting, that whole thought that we're doing what's best for women, that whole benevolent sexism thing is running rampant. And that's exactly what's going on. They're holding us down by virtue of their claims that they're lifting us up. But I definitely want to lift up your book, Sexual Justice. So can you please tell the viewers where they can find it?
Absolutely. You can find it wherever books are sold. The hardcover is already out, and the paperback will be out in June 14th.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us, Alexandra. And where can people find you on social media?
I'm at AZ Brodsky on Twitter.
Fantastic. Once again, that's Alexandra Brodsky, the author of Sexual Justice, Supporting Victims, Ensuring Due Process, and Resisting the Conservative Backlash. Thank you so much for joining us, Alexandra.
Thank you.